Have you ever been so completely underestimated by the people closest to you that you just stopped trying to prove them wrong? Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be invisible in your own family? To be the punchline of every joke? The cautionary tale whispered at holiday dinners? Let me tell you something that might shake you to your core, because what I'm about to share isn't just a story. It's my life. And it's a truth that I've carried in silence for years, watching as everyone around me built their assumptions on foundations of sand, never once questioning whether the person they thought they knew was real, or just a character I'd learned to play so convincingly that even I sometimes forgot who I really was underneath it all. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened, and more importantly, why I let it happen. Why I allowed an entire family to believe I was something I wasn't. Why I wore the mask of the poor relative, the failure, the one who never quite measured up, while beneath that carefully constructed exterior a completely different reality was taking shape, brick by brick, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. This is about the moment I stopped pretending, but not in the way you might think, because I didn't suddenly reveal everything in some grand gesture of defiance. No. What I did was far more powerful and infinitely more devastating to those who had spent years looking down on me with a mixture of pity and superiority. I let them continue believing their lie, and in doing so, I gave them enough rope to hang themselves with their own assumptions. Growing up, I was always the kid from the struggling side of the family. You know, the one, every family has them. The relatives who show up to gatherings in clothes that are just slightly worn, who bring the cheapest bottle of wine, who laugh a little too loud at jokes that aren't that funny because they're trying so hard to fit in, to be accepted, to prove that they belong at the table even though everyone else seems to have received a memo that they didn't. My parents worked hard, incredibly hard, the kind of soul-crushing labor that leaves you exhausted in your bones, that steals your youth and replaces it with worry lines and gray hair that comes far too early. But despite their best efforts, we were always just barely scraping by. Always one unexpected expense away from disaster, one car repair or medical bill from complete financial ruin. My Uncle Richard, my father's older brother, he was the golden child, the successful one, the man who had built a small empire in real estate and never let anyone forget it for even a moment. His house was the kind of place you see in magazines. All marble countertops and vaulted ceilings and a garage that held more cars than most people own in a lifetime. And every family gathering was held there, in that monument to his success, as if the location itself was meant to remind everyone of the hierarchy, of who had made it and who was still struggling in the shadows of achievement. His children, my cousins Emma and Jason, they grew up with every advantage, private schools and exotic vacations and trust funds that would ensure they'd never know what it meant to worry about money. Not really. Not in the way that keeps you awake at 3 a.m. doing calculations in your head, trying to figure out which bill you can delay paying without destroying your credit or losing something essential. I remember being 12 years old at one of those family dinners, sitting at the massive dining table that could seat 20 people comfortably, feeling small and out of place in my JCPenney polo shirt, while my cousins wore designer labels I couldn't even pronounce, watching as Uncle Richard held court at the head of the table, dispensing wisdom and advice like some kind of benevolent king. And I remember the exact moment when he turned his attention to me, his eyes assessing me with that look I would come to know so well, that mixture of pity and condescension that successful people often wear when looking at those they consider less fortunate. He asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said something about computers because I'd always been fascinated by technology, by the way these machines could be programmed to do incredible things, and I'll never forget the way he chuckled, actually chuckled, and said that was nice, that maybe I could work in tech support or something, fixing computers for people who actually understood business. And the whole table laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with that kind of casual dismissiveness that's somehow worse than outright mockery, because it doesn't even acknowledge you as enough of a threat to take seriously. My father's face went red, and my mother squeezed my hand under the table, but I just smiled and nodded because what else could I do? I was 12, and powerless, and sitting in a house that probably cost more than my parents would earn in their entire lifetimes combined. And in that moment, something crystallized inside me, something hard and determined and absolutely unshakable, a resolution that I didn't fully understand then, but that would shape everything that came after. The years that followed were a masterclass in being underestimated, in having every achievement dismissed or minimized, every success attributed to luck or charity rather than merit or hard work. And I learned to smile through it, to nod along when Uncle Richard gave me career advice that was completely wrong for what I was actually doing, to accept the handed-down clothes from my cousins and the gift cards to chain restaurants for birthdays while they got cars and exotic trips, to be grateful for the scraps from the table of prosperity. I went to community college because that's what we could afford, working 30 hours a week at a grocery store while carrying a full course load, studying computer science and business because I understood even then that technical skills without business acumen would only get me so far, and every family gathering became an exercise in patience as I fielded questions about when I was going to get a real job, when I was going to give up this computer hobby and do something practical, something stable, something that made sense to people who measured success in traditional terms of corporate ladders and corner offices. I graduated with honors, but Uncle Richard barely acknowledged it, too busy talking about Jason's acceptance to Yale, and when I got my first job at a small tech startup making barely enough to cover rent and student loans, the family reaction was exactly what I expected. Sympathetic nods and encouraging platitudes that barely masked the underlying message that this was about what they'd expected from me, that I was fulfilling the prophecy they'd written for my life before I was old enough to hold a pen. But here's what they didn't know, what I never told them, what I carefully concealed behind a facade of modest struggle and grateful acceptance of their occasional charity. I was learning, absorbing everything I could about technology and business and the emerging digital economy that was about to reshape everything, staying up until 2 and 3 in the morning reading white papers and teaching myself programming languages and studying market trends, pouring every spare dollar into books and online courses and eventually into carefully calculated investments that most people had never heard of, because they were too busy chasing traditional markers of success to see the revolution happening in plain sight. The startup I joined, the one Uncle Richard had dismissed as another tech company that would probably fold within a year, it was working on something revolutionary, and I wasn't just an entry-level employee. I was one of the first 10 people hired, which meant I had equity, real equity, the kind that could change lives if things went well, but I never mentioned that at family dinners. I just smiled and accepted their sympathy and let them believe I was barely getting by while I watched my stake in the company grow with each funding round, each new client, each technological breakthrough that brought us closer to the IPO that I knew was coming, even if I couldn't say when. The decision to stop explaining myself, to stop trying to prove anything to anyone, it didn't come all at once, it was gradual, a slow realization that their underestimation of me wasn't actually a problem. It was a gift, because it meant I could work without pressure, without expectations, without the weight of family judgment watching my every move and waiting for me to fail so they could say they knew it all along. I started actively cultivating the image of the struggling relative, wearing the same old jacket to gatherings even though I could afford new clothes, driving the same beat-up Honda even as my bank account grew, living in a modest apartment in an unfashionable neighborhood even though I could have moved somewhere nicer, because every sacrifice I made, every moment of looking poor while building wealth, it was buying me something more valuable than comfort. It was buying me freedom. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from judgment. Freedom from having to explain or justify or defend my choices to people who had already decided who I was and what I would become. Have you ever experienced that kind of liberation? That understanding that other people's opinions of you are their problem, not yours. That you can simply opt out of the game of proving yourself and instead focus all your energy on actually building something real? Comment below if you've ever felt invisible to your family, because I want to know I'm not alone in this. My cousin Emma got married when I was 26, and it was the kind of wedding you see in movies. A destination event in the Bahamas that cost more than most people's houses. And I was invited, of course, because family is family. But the invitation came with the unspoken understanding that they didn't really expect me to come, that the flight and hotel would be too expensive for someone like me, and I could see the surprise on their faces when I RSVP'd. Yes, could almost hear the whispered conversations about how they'd probably have to help me out with expenses. How generous it was of Emma to include me, even though I clearly didn't fit in with her social circle of investment bankers and corporate lawyers and trust fund babies who'd never worked a day in their lives but somehow thought they were self-made. I went to that wedding, and I played my part perfectly, wearing a suit that was nice but not too nice, that looked like something I might have scraped together for a special occasion, sitting at the table with the distant relatives and family friends, rather than at the head table where the important people sat, watching as Uncle Richard gave a toast about how proud he was of his daughter, how she'd found someone worthy of the family legacy, how they would build an empire together that would last for generations. And through it all, I just smiled and clapped and felt the weight of the secret I was carrying. The knowledge that in my pocket was a phone that had an app showing me my net worth. And that number, if anyone had seen it, would have caused jaws to drop and conversations to stop and the entire carefully constructed narrative of who was successful and who was struggling to collapse like a house of cards in a strong wind. The tech company I'd joined, it went public 2 months after Emma's wedding, and my equity, those shares I'd accumulated over 5 years of below-market salary and 80-hour work weeks and believing in a vision that most people thought was crazy, they were suddenly worth real money. Life-changing money, the kind of money that Uncle Richard would have respected if he'd known about it. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't show up to the next family, gathering in a new car or expensive clothes. I just quietly sold enough shares to diversify my portfolio, investing in real estate and index funds, and a small venture capital fund that was backing the next generation of startups, building wealth not for show but for security, for freedom, for the possibility of a life where I never had to worry about money again, where I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. My parents knew, of course, I'd made sure they were taken care of, paying off their mortgage and setting up trust funds that would ensure their retirement was comfortable, but they understood. They'd watched me endure years of condescension and dismissal, and they agreed that there was a certain justice in letting the rest of the family continue in their ignorance, in allowing Uncle Richard to keep giving me advice about getting my foot in the door at his real estate company, in letting my cousins continue to gift me things they thought I needed, because clearly I couldn't afford to buy them myself. The thing about wearing a mask for so long is that it becomes comfortable, familiar, safe. And there were times when I questioned what I was doing, when I wondered if I was being petty or vindictive, if I was letting pride and old wounds drive decisions that should have been motivated by love and family connection. But then I'd remember that 12-year-old kid sitting at that dinner table, being laughed at for his dreams, being patted on the head and dismissed as someone whose ambitions exceeded his station, and I'd remember every subsequent year of casual cruelty disguised as concern, every piece of advice that was really a judgment, every gift that was really a reminder of my supposed inferiority. And I'd think, no, this isn't about revenge. This is about peace, about being able to exist without constantly defending myself, about letting them believe what they want to believe while I build the life I actually want rather than the life they think I should want. There's power in being underestimated, real power, because when people think you're harmless, when they think you're not a threat, when they think they have you figured out and filed away in a neat little box labeled failure or mediocrity or disappointment, they stop watching you. They stop paying attention. They stop noticing the changes and the growth and the transformation happening right in front of their eyes. And by the time they realize their mistake, if they ever do, it's too late to do anything about it except confront the reality that maybe they never knew you at all. That maybe the person they pitied was just a character in a story they told themselves to feel better about their own lives and choices. I was 30 when the cracks started to show. Small things at first, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, and my family certainly wasn't paying attention. They'd long since relegated me to the background of family dynamics, the permanent supporting character who would never have a storyline of his own. Uncle Richard started having financial troubles. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to worry him. The real estate market had shifted and his portfolio was overextended. He'd made some bad bets on commercial properties right before the market corrected, and suddenly the man who'd never known financial stress was learning what it felt like to wake up at 3 in the morning with anxiety gnawing at your gut. And I watched this happen with a complex mixture of emotions. Not quite satisfaction, but not quite sympathy either. Something in between that I still don't have a name for. My cousin Jason, the Yale graduate with all the advantages, he'd gone into finance like everyone expected, but he wasn't the prodigy everyone had assumed he'd be. He was competent but not exceptional, good but not great, climbing the corporate ladder but slowly, watching as people younger and hungrier passed him by because he'd never had to develop the hunger that comes from having something to prove, from knowing that failure means real consequences rather than just disappointment. Emma's marriage, the fairy tale wedding in the Bahamas, it was struggling. Her husband had turned out to be more interested in her trust fund than in her, and they were heading toward a divorce that would be expensive and messy and would shatter the image of perfection that had been so carefully cultivated. And me, I was quietly accumulating more wealth, making smart investments, starting to do angel investing in promising startups, building a reputation in certain circles as someone who understood technology and had the capital and judgment to back winners. But none of this was visible to my family because I'd trained them not to look, not to question, not to wonder if maybe the story they'd been telling themselves about me was wrong. I still drove that old Honda, though I'd bought a Tesla that sat in a private garage across town, still lived in that modest apartment, though I owned 3 rental properties that generated passive income every month, still wore clothes that looked like they came from Target, though my closet also held custom suits I'd never worn to a family event, and the duality of my existence, the split between who they thought I was and who I actually was, it had become so natural that sometimes I forgot which version of me was real. Or maybe they were both real. Maybe we're all playing characters to some degree, showing different faces to different audiences, and the only difference was that my performance had gone on so long and been so convincing that even I sometimes got lost in it. There were moments of temptation, times when I wanted to drop the mask and show them everything, to walk into a family dinner in that custom suit and hand Uncle Richard a business card with my venture capital firm's name on it, and watch his face as he realized that the poor relative he'd been patronizing for decades was now wealthier than he'd ever been. But something always held me back. Maybe wisdom, maybe cowardice, maybe just a sense that the revelation wouldn't bring the satisfaction I imagined, that it would change everything in ways I couldn't control or predict, that once the truth was out there, I could never go back to the comfortable invisibility I'd created for myself. The real turning point came at my 32nd birthday, which fell on the same weekend as a major family reunion, the kind of gathering where everyone shows up, distant relatives you haven't seen in years, great aunts and second cousins, and people whose exact relationship to you is unclear but who share enough DNA to warrant an invitation. And it was being held at Uncle Richard's house because of course it was, even though his financial situation had deteriorated to the point where I knew he'd had to take out a second mortgage to maintain the lifestyle everyone expected of him. I almost didn't go. I'd been traveling for work, meeting with startup founders in Silicon Valley and Austin, attending conferences where I was increasingly being invited to speak on panels about early-stage investing and the future of technology, living a life that bore no resemblance to the one my family imagined for me. But something drew me back. Maybe curiosity, maybe a sense that it was time, maybe just the pull of family that never really goes away, no matter how complicated the relationship becomes. I showed up in my old Honda, wearing jeans and a polo shirt that had seen better days, carrying a 6-pack of beer as my contribution to the party, playing my role so well that it was almost method acting, and I could see the familiar mixture of pity and dismissal in people's eyes as they greeted me, the way conversations would pause when I approached, and then resume with that slight shift in tone that tells you people were just talking about you, probably about how sad it was that I still hadn't gotten my life together, that I was still struggling while everyone else had moved on to adult success and stability. Uncle Richard cornered me by the pool, drink in hand, and started giving me advice about a job opening he'd heard about. Something entry-level at a friend's company, nothing special, but it had benefits, and maybe if I worked hard I could eventually work my way up to something respectable. And I just nodded and thanked him for thinking of me, playing the grateful nephew even as part of me marveled at the absurdity of the situation, that this man who was drowning in debt and desperately trying to hide his financial problems was giving career advice to someone who could have written him a check to solve all his problems without it even denting my portfolio. And I wondered what he would say if he knew, if he would apologize for all the years of condescension, if he would feel ashamed or embarrassed, or if he would just find some way to rationalize it, to convince himself that his assumptions had been reasonable, given the information available to him. Emma was there with her soon-to-be ex-husband, putting on a brave face but unable to hide the tension between them, and she pulled me aside at one point to tell me how lucky I was that I didn't have to deal with all the complications of marriage and divorce, that being single and unattached had its advantages, and I almost laughed because she was romanticizing my supposed loneliness, finding comfort in the idea that my lack of romantic success was somehow a blessing. Never mind that I'd been in a serious relationship for 3 years with someone I'd met at a tech conference, someone successful and brilliant who understood my world, because she inhabited the same spaces, but I'd never mentioned her to the family because why would I? Why would I invite that scrutiny and judgment and the inevitable questions about when we were getting married and having kids? Why would I give them another thing to have opinions about when I could just keep that part of my life private and sacred and separate from all the family drama? The breaking point came not with a bang but with a whisper, with a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. I was in the house using the bathroom when I heard voices in the adjacent study. Uncle Richard and his wife, my Aunt Patricia, having an argument about money, about how they couldn't keep up appearances much longer, about how they might have to sell the house and downsize, about how humiliating it would be to admit to the family that they weren't as successful as everyone thought. And then I heard my name, heard Uncle Richard say that at least they hadn't ended up like me, that no matter how bad things got, they still had their dignity, they still had their reputation, they hadn't wasted their potential like I had, and something inside me, something that had been wound tight for 2 decades, finally snapped. Not in anger exactly, but in a kind of clarity, a sudden understanding that I'd been giving these people power over me by caring what they thought, by letting their opinions and judgments shape my behavior even if only in reaction to them, that the mask I'd been wearing wasn't protecting me, it was imprisoning me, and that there was a difference between choosing privacy and choosing invisibility, between protecting your peace and hiding your truth. I left the bathroom and walked back to the party, and I could feel something shifting inside me, a loosening of bonds I hadn't fully realized were there, a sense that the game I'd been playing for so long had reached its natural conclusion, and it was time, finally time, to stop pretending, not for them, but for me, because I deserved to exist as my full self, to stop compartmentalizing my life into the parts they could see and the parts they couldn't, to stop treating my success as something shameful that needed to be hidden. But I didn't make some grand announcement. I didn't gather everyone together and reveal everything in one dramatic moment. That's not how real life works. That's not how real change happens. Instead, I just started being honest, started answering questions truthfully instead of vaguely, started showing up as who I actually was instead of who they expected me to be. When Jason asked what I'd been up to, I told him about the startup I'd invested in that was about to close a Series B funding round. When Emma inquired about my love life, I mentioned my girlfriend and the fact that we were thinking about buying a house together. When Uncle Richard asked if I was still doing that computer stuff, I explained that I was running a venture capital fund focused on emerging technologies and that I'd just closed a deal with a company developing revolutionary AI applications, and the reactions were fascinating. A mixture of confusion and disbelief and the slow dawning realization that maybe I wasn't who they thought I was, that maybe I'd never been that person, that maybe they'd been operating on outdated information and incorrect assumptions for years without ever questioning whether their model of reality was accurate. Uncle Richard laughed nervously and said I must be joking, that I couldn't possibly be doing those things because wouldn't they have known? Wouldn't I have told them? And I just looked at him with what I hoped was kindness rather than triumph, and said that I'd stop trying to explain my life to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be, that I'd learned a long time ago that some people don't want the truth, they want their version of the truth, and it was easier to let them have it than to constantly fight against their preconceptions. The party continued, but the energy had shifted. I could see people whispering, could feel the stares, could sense the questions forming, and over the following weeks and months, the truth began to emerge in pieces. Emma did some research and found articles mentioning my venture capital firm. Jason ran into someone who knew someone who confirmed that yes, I was exactly who I said I was. My parents finally felt comfortable sharing some of the details they'd been keeping quiet about, and the family. Narrative began to unravel, threads pulling loose from a tapestry that had seemed so solid but turned out to be held together by nothing more than assumptions and gossip and the human tendency to create stories that confirm our existing beliefs. Uncle Richard tried to play it off like he'd known all along, like he'd just been testing me or giving me room to grow, but I could see in his eyes that he was recalculating everything, rewriting history in his head, trying to figure out how he'd missed the signs, and part of me felt sympathy for him, because I understood now that his need to feel superior had been driven by his own insecurities, that putting me down had been a way of propping himself up, that the hierarchy he'd enforced so strictly had been protecting him as much as it had been limiting me. Emma apologized, actually apologized, for the years of dismissiveness, for assuming that my lack of outward success meant I wasn't successful, for confusing poverty of appearance with poverty of reality, and I accepted her apology because holding grudges takes energy, and I had better things to do with mine, because I understood that she'd been taught to measure worth in very specific ways, and it took courage to question those measurements, to admit that maybe she'd been wrong. The aftermath wasn't simple or clean. Relationships don't transform overnight just because new information has come to light. There was awkwardness and adjustment and moments where the old patterns tried to reassert themselves before everyone remembered that the rules had changed, that I wasn't the poor relative anymore, that I maybe never had been, that the only thing that had changed was their knowledge, not my reality. Some people in the family struggled with it more than others. Some felt foolish or embarrassed. Some felt angry that I'd deceived them even though I'd never lied. I'd just stopped correcting their misconceptions. Some felt hurt that I hadn't trusted them with the truth, and I had to explain over and over that it wasn't about trust. It was about self-preservation, about creating space to grow without the pressure of expectations, about learning to value my own opinion of myself more than their opinions of me. Uncle Richard and I had a conversation months later, after the dust had settled, after he'd had time to process everything, and he admitted that he'd been projecting his own fears onto me, that seeing me struggle had made him feel more secure in his own success, and that realizing I hadn't been struggling at all had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself and his choices, and I appreciated his honesty even if it didn't erase the past, even if it couldn't give back the years I'd spent feeling invisible and undervalued in my own family. Looking back now, I don't regret the path I took, the years of silence and secrecy and letting people believe what they wanted to believe, because those years taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. They taught me that external validation is a trap, that success means nothing if you're living for other people's approval, that the only opinion that matters is your own, that you can't control how people see you, but you can control how much power you give their perceptions. They taught me resilience and patience and the value of playing the long game, of building something real rather than something that looks impressive on social media or at family gatherings. I learned that there's a difference between humility and self-diminishment, between being private and being ashamed, between choosing your battles and letting people walk all over you, and I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, is to let people underestimate you while you quietly build an empire they can't see, and then one day, when the time is right, to simply stop hiding, not with fanfare or drama, but with quiet confidence that needs no justification or explanation. The truth is, I didn't stop pretending to teach anyone a lesson or to prove anyone wrong. I stopped pretending because I was exhausted, because maintaining the facade had become more work than just being myself, because I finally understood that I didn't owe anyone a performance, that I could just exist as I was, and the people who mattered would accept it, and the people who didn't weren't worth my energy anyway. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway from this long, complicated story about family and expectations and the masks we wear and the truths we hide? Maybe it's that people will always make assumptions about you based on limited information and their own biases and experiences, and you can either spend your life fighting against those assumptions, or you can accept them as their problem rather than yours. Maybe it's that success doesn't look the same for everyone, that wealth and achievement and happiness come in forms that don't always fit conventional narratives, that the person who looks like they're struggling might be thriving in ways you can't see, and the person who looks like they have it all figured out might be drowning beneath the surface. Maybe it's that family is complicated, that love and resentment and pride and shame can all exist simultaneously, that people can hurt you without meaning to and help you without realizing it, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it might mean understanding, seeing the full picture instead of just the parts that caused you pain. Or maybe the lesson is simpler than all that. Maybe it's just that you should never assume you know someone's story based on appearances, that the quiet person in the corner might have depths you can't imagine, that the relative everyone pities might be living a life richer and fuller than any of you realized, that judgments based on external circumstances are almost always incomplete and often completely wrong. I want you to think about your own life right now, about the assumptions people have made about you, about the boxes they've tried to put you in, about the times you've been underestimated or dismissed or treated as less than you are, and I want you to ask yourself, are you living for their approval or your own? Are you building the life you actually want, or the life they think you should want? Are you hiding parts of yourself to avoid judgment? Or are you standing fully in your truth, regardless of how others might react? Have you ever been the one making assumptions, looking at someone's circumstances and creating a whole narrative about who they are and what they're capable of without really knowing them, without asking questions, without considering that maybe you're missing crucial information, that maybe the story you're telling yourself is convenient but inaccurate? These are uncomfortable questions, I know, because they force us to examine our own biases and judgments, to acknowledge that we might be wrong, that we might be causing harm even when we think we're being helpful or concerned. But they're important questions because the answer to them determines not just how we treat others, but how we allow ourselves to be treated, whether we give power to other people's opinions or whether we claim the right to define ourselves on our own terms. Comment below and tell me about a time when someone completely misjudged you, when they assumed things about your life or capabilities that were completely wrong. Because I want to hear your stories. I want to know that this experience of being underestimated and dismissed and having to prove yourself isn't unique to me, that it's something many of us face and overcome in different ways. Understanding the content I've shared today isn't just about relating to my specific story. It's about recognizing patterns in your own life, about seeing the ways that other people's expectations and assumptions might be limiting you or causing you to limit yourself, about learning to distinguish between helpful feedback and harmful judgment, about developing the confidence to chart your own course, even when everyone around you is telling you you're going in the wrong direction. It's about understanding that success and happiness and fulfillment are deeply personal things that can't be measured by someone else's standards, that the metrics that matter are the ones you choose, not the ones imposed on you by family or society or social media, or any other external force that thinks it knows better than you do what your life should look like. This understanding can change everything. It can free you from the exhausting work of constantly justifying yourself, of trying to make people see you differently, of living in reaction to their judgments rather than in alignment with your own values. It can give you permission to be exactly who you are, to succeed or fail on your own terms, to build a life that makes sense to you, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. And that freedom, that liberation from the weight of external expectations, it's worth more than any amount of money or status or approval could ever be worth. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something deep inside that maybe you haven't fully acknowledged or examined, if it made you think about your own life and relationships in new ways, I want you to do something for me. I want you to leave a like on this video right now, not just because it helps the algorithm and allows more people to hear this message, but because that small action is a way of acknowledging your own truth, of saying, yes, this matters, this is important, I see myself in this story and I'm not alone in these experiences. It's a way of connecting with the thousands of other people who are watching this and having the same realizations, who are sitting there nodding their heads and feeling seen and understood in ways they maybe haven't felt before. And if you want more stories like this, more honest, raw, real conversations about the complicated realities of family and success and identity, and all the things we usually keep hidden beneath polite surfaces, then subscribe to My Verdad Revelada right now. Hit that subscription button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Because I'm committed to creating content that speaks truth, that doesn't shy away from the difficult topics, that acknowledges that life is messy and complicated and doesn't always fit into neat narratives with clear morals and happy endings. This channel is about revealing truth, my truth, your truth, the truths we all carry but rarely speak out loud, and I want you to be part of this community, part of this conversation, part of this movement toward greater honesty and authenticity in how we talk about our lives and experiences. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for giving me your time and attention in a world that's constantly demanding both, for being willing to sit with discomfort and complexity rather than reaching for easy answers or simple judgments. Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me, not as the poor relative my family thought I was, or as the successful investor I turned out to be, but as a complete human being with contradictions and complications and a story that defies simple categorization. And I hope that in seeing me you've also seen yourself more clearly. I hope you've recognized that you too are more than anyone's assumptions about you, that you too have depths and complexities that deserve to be acknowledged and honored. that you too have the right to define yourself on your own terms and build a life that reflects your values rather than someone else's expectations. So go forward from here with that knowledge, with that power, with that freedom, and never let anyone make you feel small again. Never let anyone's underestimation of you become your own underestimation of yourself, because you are capable of more than they imagine, more than you might even imagine right now, and the only way to discover the full extent of your potential is to stop living for their approval and start living for your own truth, whatever that might be, wherever it might lead you, however different it might look from the path everyone expected you to take.